The lights of the Senate chamber glowed faintly against the pale marble walls, and 1,000 eyes fixed on one man. Joseph Valachi sat before the committee, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The year was 1963, and America was about to hear something it was never meant to know. For decades, the Mafia had been a whisper, an invisible empire built on loyalty, silence, and fear. But tonight, that whisper was about to become a confession. The quiet rustle of papers, the soft hum of cameras, and the tension in the air made the moment feel like the opening of a forbidden book. Valachi wasn't a boss, not even a captain. He was an ordinary soldier, an obedient cog in the vast machine of organized crime. Yet he carried something no one else dared to speak, the truth about La Cosa Nostra. In a calm but nervous voice, he began to talk about the family, about oaths taken in blood, about a world ruled by men who never appeared in newspapers but decided life and death from behind smoke-filled rooms. It was the first time in American history that the Mafia had a voice, and that voice came from a man who once swore to die before revealing its secrets. Imagine the silence that followed each sentence he spoke. Every word chipped away at the myth the Mafia had built for decades. Senators leaned forward in disbelief, journalists scribbled frantic notes, and millions at home listened through their television sets as the underworld came alive in their imaginations. The shadowy figures who once ruled New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were suddenly human, vulnerable, frightened, exposed. And at the center of it all sat Joe Valachi, a man who had lived and breathed that darkness, now standing against it. He spoke not with pride, but with exhaustion. Years of running, killing, and hiding had worn him down. There was no glory left, only the need to be heard before the end. His voice carried the weariness of a man haunted by ghosts, friends buried in silence, enemies lurking in every corner of his memory. The senators didn't see a hero or a villain. They saw a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had violated omerta, the sacred vow of silence that bound every Mafia member from birth to death. Outside the chamber, the world buzzed with curiosity and fear. Newspapers called him the rat who revealed the Mafia. To some, he was a coward. To others, he was a man who finally lifted the veil from one of America's most secret societies. His testimony would lead to hundreds of arrests, endless debates, and a new understanding of how power moved in the shadows of modern cities. But that night, as he sat before the committee, none of that mattered. What mattered was survival, one man's desperate attempt to stay alive by telling everything he knew. In his mind, the memories flickered like black and white film reels, the alleyways of Little Italy, the clink of glasses at hidden bars, the cold eyes of men who would kill for loyalty. He remembered the oath, the candlelight ceremony where he swore allegiance to his family, to honor above all else. And now, he was breaking that oath publicly, on record, before the entire world. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same loyalty that had once protected him had turned into the very force that sought his death. Valachi's confession wasn't just a betrayal, it was the sound of an empire cracking. For the first time, America understood that the Mafia wasn't a myth, but a structure, a system of ranks, codes, and territories operating like a shadow government. It had rules, discipline, and its own form of justice. And now, those rules were being spoken aloud by the man who had once sworn to die keeping them secret. The calm tone of his voice betrayed the storm inside. Every name he uttered, every ritual he described, meant another nail in his own coffin. He knew there was no going back. The Mafia didn't forgive, it remembered. Somewhere out there, men were already planning his silence. But Valachi continued to speak, as if each word freed him from years of chains. As the hearing drew to a close, the audience exhaled, realizing they had just witnessed something historic. A world built on whispers had been forced into daylight. The underworld had a face, a name, and a voice. And that voice belonged to a tired man whose story was only beginning to unfold. What led him to this chair, to this confession, to the decision to destroy the very world that once protected him? That is where the journey begins, the story of Joe Valachi, the soldier who broke the silence, the man who revealed the Mafia's deepest secrets to a world that had only guessed at its existence. The tale of a man who lived by loyalty, died by betrayal, and in between, changed history forever. The year was 1904, and the air in New York's Little Italy carried a strange mix of hope and despair. Steam rose from manhole covers, mingling with the smell of coal smoke and bread fresh from the bakeries. Narrow streets echoed with the clatter of horse carts and the shouts of street vendors calling out in Italian. This was a neighborhood of dreams and ghosts, where families from the old world tried to build new lives in the shadows of tenement buildings that seemed to lean in on each other like weary men. It was here that Joseph Valachi was born, a small boy in a world too crowded for innocence. His father was a laborer, a quiet man hardened by work and disappointment. His mother stayed home, raising her children in a cramped apartment where the wallpaper peeled like old skin. The family was poor, even by immigrant standards, but poverty was not uncommon on Mulberry Street. Every window held a story of struggle, every alley was filled with laughter that often turned to arguments by nightfall. Joe grew up watching his parents stretch every penny, his father coming home with cracked hands and tired eyes. From the start, he understood that survival here required something beyond honesty, it required toughness. In those early years, Little Italy was its own world, ruled not by politicians or police, but by quiet men in long coats who carried themselves with confidence. They spoke softly, but their words carried power. To a boy like Joe, they were figures of mystery, men who seemed untouched by the suffering around them. They had money, respect, and a kind of dark grace. The neighbors whispered their names, never too loudly. The Black Hand, some said. The Society, others murmured. Even before he could understand what those words meant, young Joe felt their pull. There was a strange pride in being feared, a kind of freedom in not depending on anyone else. As a child, Joe spent hours on the street corners, watching older boys hustle dice games and carry messages for men in suits. They always seemed to have a few extra coins in their pockets, enough to buy sweets or help their families. Respect came easily to them, people stepped aside when they passed. Joe wanted that respect, not out of greed, but out of hunger for significance. In a world that overlooked people like him, the gangsters were the ones who couldn't be ignored. School was never his sanctuary. He was restless, distracted, drawn more to the rhythm of the streets than to books. Teachers called him stubborn, and maybe he was. The city was his classroom, and survival was the only subject that mattered. He learned how to read faces, how to sense danger before it arrived, how to slip away when police whistles cut through the night. By his teenage years, he was already running small errands for the street toughs, delivering messages, keeping watch, collecting small debts. Each task came with a few coins, and each coin felt like validation. But Little Italy was not just a place of crime. It was a living mosaic of faith, family, and fear. On Sundays, church bells rang through the narrow streets, and mothers led their children by the hand to Mass. Joe went, too, sometimes. His mother's faith was strong, her prayers endless. She prayed for safety, for decency, for her son to stay out of trouble. Yet trouble had a way of finding him. The streets offered more than sermons, they offered belonging, power, and a sense of being seen. And for a boy who grew up invisible, that was irresistible. As the years passed, the neighborhood began to change. Immigrants arrived from every corner of Italy, Sicilians, Neapolitans, Calabrians, each bringing their customs, their dialects, and their rivalries. Fights broke out over territory, pride, or insult. Joe watched as older men settled disputes not with words, but with violence carried out in the quiet hours before dawn. Death came silently here, wrapped in shadows and buried beneath whispered explanations. It wasn't evil in their eyes, it was business, justice by another name. The teenage Valachi was no stranger to fear, but he learned to master it. He understood that courage wasn't about not feeling fear, it was about moving despite it. He began hanging around with a group of small-time thieves, boys who called themselves the Minutemen because of how quickly they struck. They robbed delivery trucks and warehouses, always in and out within a minute. For Joe, it was thrilling, the rush of the chase, the silence afterward when adrenaline still hummed in his veins. He was learning the trade that would shape his life, though he didn't yet know how far it would take him. At night, he would return home quietly, careful not to wake his mother. He would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the city, the barking dogs, the laughter of drunks, the occasional echo of a gunshot far away. Sometimes he wondered if he was meant for something better. But the next morning, the hunger returned, not the hunger for food, but for control, for a life that wasn't ordinary. He didn't want to be like his father, working until his hands broke and dying without leaving a mark. He wanted to be remembered, even feared. There were moments when the streets seemed almost beautiful. The golden glow of street lamps reflected in puddles, the hum of voices mixing with the music from open windows. It was a world full of life, chaos, and contradictions. In the same alley where children played stickball during the day, deals were made under cover of night. And Joe stood between both worlds, part child, part man, unsure which would claim him first. As he grew older, the men in suits began to notice him. They admired his reliability, his silence, the way he never asked unnecessary questions. In a world built on secrecy, those qualities mattered. They called him a good boy, and in their tone, it sounded like a compliment. Joe didn't realize it yet, but he was already being groomed, not for a job, but for a life. The kind of life that didn't offer retirement, only survival or death. In the dim light of his youth, Joe Valachi was just another boy from Mulberry Street, one of thousands. But behind his quiet eyes, the seeds of destiny were taking root. He didn't yet know the cost of the respect he sought, or the blood that would one day stain his hands. For now, he was still just watching, learning, and dreaming. The ghosts of the neighborhood, those men who walked the line between honor and crime, had found a new apprentice. And soon, Joe would take his first real step into their world, where the price of belonging was everything he had left to lose. The city was changing, and so was Joe Valachi. By the time he reached his late teens, New York streets had become an unpredictable theater of opportunity and danger. The Great Depression had tightened its grip on the working poor, and honest jobs were as rare as peace in the back alleys of the Bronx. The line between survival and crime grew thinner every day, and Joe, sharp-eyed, quick-handed, and desperate to escape poverty, was ready to cross it. His initiation into the world of petty crime began quietly, almost naturally. It started with running errands for small-time hustlers, delivering envelopes, carrying messages, guarding trucks during deliveries that weren't always legal. Joe was good at it. He had a calmness about him, a sense of control that made others trust him. Soon, he was drawn deeper into what the locals called the numbers game, an illegal lottery that thrived in the neighborhoods where hope was scarce. For every poor man dreaming of a lucky number, there was a bookmaker waiting to collect, and Joe found himself somewhere in the middle, counting coins, keeping ledgers, and learning how money flowed through the underworld. The numbers racket was the perfect school for a young gangster. It required discipline, loyalty, and silence. Every day, Joe carried slips from customers to collectors, memorizing names and amounts without ever writing them down. He understood the power of discretion early on. In this business, talking too much was the fastest way to disappear. He watched and learned, who paid protection money, which cops could be bought, which ones couldn't. It wasn't glamorous, but to Joe, it felt like progress, a ladder leading upward, one rung at a time. The work was simple but dangerous. Rival crews often fought over territory, and even small mistakes could invite violent consequences. One evening, Joe saw his first killing, a fellow runner caught cheating the system, shot in the back of the head and left in an alley. The sight stayed with him, but he didn't turn away. In the underworld, fear was natural, even necessary. What mattered was not letting it show. That night, Joe understood something essential: to survive in this life, you had to treat death like weather, unavoidable, impersonal, and always on the horizon. As the years passed, Valachi's reputation grew. He wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but he was reliable, and reliability was worth more than courage. He was the kind of man who followed orders without complaint and never asked why. The older men respected that. They began trusting him with more responsibility, collections, payoffs, even mediating small disputes between gamblers. Slowly, his world expanded from street corners to backrooms, from petty hustlers to real mob figures. It was during this time that Joe first brushed shoulders with members of the Reina family, one of the powerful mafia groups operating in New York. They controlled lucrative rackets in the Bronx and had ties to men like Lucky Luciano and Tommy Gagliano, names that would soon define American organized crime. Joe didn't know it then, but these encounters would change the course of his life. He was being watched, tested, and quietly evaluated by men who could open doors, or close them permanently. In those smoky backrooms, Joe learned that crime wasn't just chaos, it was business. There were unwritten rules, hierarchies, and codes of conduct. Each man had his place, and knowing that place meant survival. He noticed how the older mobsters dressed neatly, spoke politely, and never raised their voices. Violence wasn't impulsive, it was calculated, deliberate, and often carried out with frightening calm. Joe admired that discipline. He saw in it something almost noble, a distorted reflection of order in a world that otherwise felt lawless. He also began to understand the value of connections. In the criminal world, who you knew mattered more than what you did. A favor today could mean protection tomorrow. Joe started building his own small network, bartenders who whispered about raids, drivers who carried messages without asking questions, and cops who pretended not to see. He wasn't yet part of the mafia, but he was orbiting it, slowly being pulled toward its dark gravity. His first real break came through a local bookmaker named Tony Bender, a man who saw potential in Joe's quiet efficiency. Bender taught him the art of running numbers and managing small gambling rings. Under his guidance, Joe refined his instincts. He learned when to press, when to back off, and how to read people's intentions just by the way they held a cigarette or avoided eye contact. Every lesson was valuable. Every mistake was dangerous. There was a rhythm to the life, a daily dance of risk and reward. Mornings began with collecting bets, afternoons with counting money, and nights with making deliveries. Joe rarely slept deeply anymore. The sounds of the city kept him alert, the distant sirens, the creak of footsteps in the hall, the whisper of someone knocking at the wrong door. He lived in constant motion, one foot in daylight, the other in darkness. But beneath his growing confidence was an unspoken truth: he was still a pawn. The men above him, the real bosses, were invisible. They moved in silence, protected by layers of loyalty and fear. Joe could feel their presence but never see their faces. He wondered what it would be like to sit among them, to have that kind of control. Ambition stirred in him quietly, like an ember waiting for air. One night, while collecting payments, Joe narrowly escaped a police raid. He ducked into a back alley, heart pounding, as sirens wailed nearby. He pressed himself against a cold brick wall, clutching a bundle of envelopes under his coat. In that breathless moment, a strange realization came over him: he wasn't scared anymore. The fear that once kept him cautious had turned into something else: excitement. The danger no longer felt like a threat. It felt like proof that he was alive. By his mid-20s, Joe Valachi had carved out a place for himself in the Bronx underworld. He wasn't rich, but he was respected. He had money in his pocket, clean suits, and friends in low and high places. The boy who once watched gangsters from the curb was now one of them, still small-time, but climbing. He could sense a larger destiny ahead, though he didn't yet know where it would lead. The transition from street hustler to full-fledged mobster was already in motion. The people he worked for were connected to bigger families, and those families were quietly reshaping the very structure of organized crime in America. Joe was being drawn toward a new kind of power, one that demanded absolute loyalty and offered only two exits, death or prison. As he walked the dimly lit streets at night, passing the same bakeries and alleyways he'd known since childhood, Joe sometimes thought about his mother's prayers. He wondered if she still lit candles for him at church, still hoped he would find a decent path. But in his heart, he knew there was no turning back. The streets had claimed him, shaped him, and defined him. He had chosen his side, whether he realized it or not. The boy from Mulberry Street was gone. In his place stood a man who understood the game, the rules, the risks, the silence. Joe Valachi was no longer just a kid chasing respect. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a professional criminal, disciplined and determined, ready for the next step into the underworld that would one day make him both powerful and doomed. The year was 1928, and New York pulsed with the restless rhythm of the Prohibition era. The city was alive at night, music spilling from basement speakeasies, laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses, and behind it all, the steady heartbeat of the underworld that supplied it all. For Joe Valachi, now in his mid-20s, this was the beginning of a new chapter. His petty hustles had earned him respect in the Bronx, and that respect had finally reached the ears of the men who truly mattered. One of those men was Gaetano Tommy Reyna, head of the powerful Reyna crime family. Under Reyna's guidance, Joe would receive his first real taste of belonging, his baptism into a world that called itself the family. It started with an introduction. Tony Bender, Joe's mentor in the numbers game, vouched for him personally. One evening, in the back room of an unmarked bar near Arthur Avenue, Joe was brought before a group of serious men. The room smelled of cigar smoke and whiskey. The lights were dim, and the air was thick with authority. Reyna himself sat at the head of the table, a man with calm eyes and quiet power. He didn't speak much, but when he did, everyone listened. Joe, nervous but steady, was asked simple questions about loyalty, discipline, and silence. His answers were measured, honest, and respectful. He was accepted. That night marked the beginning of his new life. He wasn't yet a made man, but he was now officially working under the Reyna organization, a trusted associate, a soldier in training. The feeling was unlike anything he had known. For the first time, Joe felt part of something bigger than himself. There was structure, purpose, and most of all, brotherhood. The men in that room didn't see him as a street punk or errand boy. They saw him as one of their own, someone who could be relied upon when things turned dangerous. Under Reyna's rule, discipline came before ambition. Every man had a role, every task a reason. Joe quickly adapted. He became a driver, a lookout, and sometimes an enforcer. He learned to carry out orders without hesitation, to speak little, and to observe everything. The work was steady, the pay was good, and for once, he felt safe within the structure of organized power. There was a strange comfort in that world, dangerous, yes, but also predictable in its own way. The Reyna family controlled a large portion of the Bronx's rackets, from ice distribution to bootlegging. Their operations were smooth and quiet, unlike the flashier gangs that drew police attention. Joe spent his days delivering shipments, collecting money, and keeping watch at warehouses where trucks loaded with illicit liquor disappeared into the night. Every man knew his part, and Joe excelled in his. He was punctual, cautious, and loyal to the bone. Those qualities earned him quiet praise, the kind that mattered more than money. Within the family, a sense of loyalty ran deep, deeper than blood, deeper than law. Joe began to understand the unspoken code that bound them all, La Cosa Nostra, our thing. It was not about greed or cruelty. It was about belonging, about creating order in a world that seemed indifferent to men like them. Joe admired that idea. He saw in it a form of justice, even if twisted, a system where respect replaced corruption, where loyalty meant survival. He told himself he wasn't a criminal, he was part of an organization that took care of its own. The bonds between men in the Reyna crew were strong. They ate together, celebrated birthdays together, and mourned the fallen in silence. Joe found something close to family among them. He had grown up longing for acceptance, and now he had it. The older soldiers treated him like a younger brother, teaching him the subtleties of mob etiquette, how to greet a superior, when to keep quiet, how to handle disputes. Everything was about respect. A wrong word could start a war, a right gesture could save your life. One evening, after a successful delivery, Joe sat in a smoky cafe with a few of his crewmates. The laughter was easy, the drinks plentiful. One of the men clapped him on the back and said, "You're one of us now, Joe. You do right by the family, and the family does right by you." Those words stayed with him. For a man who had grown up poor and invisible, they felt like a promise, a kind of immortality. But beneath that warmth lurked an invisible current of danger. Joe began to notice how quickly affection could turn to suspicion, how smiles could hide calculations. The same men who toasted each other at night could be gone by morning, their names never mentioned again. Still, he didn't question it. This was the life he had chosen, and he believed in its order. Paranoia, he thought, was for those who didn't belong. Reyna himself was a distant but respected figure in Joe's mind. He admired his calm leadership. Unlike other bosses who ruled through fear, Reyna led through quiet authority. He rewarded loyalty and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Under his command, the Bronx remained relatively stable. But peace in the Mafia was always temporary, fragile as glass. Rivalries brewed beneath the surface, whispers of alliances and betrayals floated through the grapevine. Joe didn't pay them much attention, he was still too focused on proving his worth. His days followed a rhythm. Mornings began with quiet errands, afternoons with meetings in restaurants or garages, evenings with deliveries under cover of darkness. He developed an instinct for danger, a sixth sense for when to step back or keep his mouth shut. The longer he worked, the more he realized that the Mafia wasn't about violence, it was about control. Control over money, over people, and most importantly, over fear. Yet, in rare moments of reflection, Joe wondered if he was losing something. The laughter of his youth had faded, replaced by a steady, cautious silence. He no longer trusted easily. Every handshake carried weight, every look a hidden meaning. He had become part of the machinery, efficient but emotionless. Still, he couldn't deny the pride he felt when men greeted him with respect, when doors opened because of the name he worked under. The nights were his favorite. Driving through the city with the skyline glowing in the distance, Joe felt untouchable. The streets belonged to them. The law might pretend otherwise, but everyone knew who really ran the city after dark. There was power in that realization, quiet, intoxicating power. And though he couldn't see the future, somewhere deep down he sensed that power always came with a price. He would learn soon enough that the family he trusted so completely was not as unbreakable as it seemed. For now, though, Joe Valachi was content. He had found his place among men who valued loyalty, courage, and silence. He believed he had finally made it, that the hard years of struggle had led him to the safety of brotherhood. But in the underworld, brotherhood was a promise written in smoke. One change in the wind, and everything could disappear. The loyalty he cherished, the family he served, the peace he felt, all of it was more fragile than he realized. The streets that had given him a home could, at any moment, take it away. And soon, they would. The 1920s rolled forward like a roaring tide, and New York City was its restless heart. It was the age of jazz and smoke, of laughter spilling out of hidden basements and fortunes built on forbidden liquor. When the Volstead Act banned alcohol, it did more than close saloons, it gave birth to an empire. Beneath the city's glittering nightlife, men like Joe Valachi found purpose. For the first time, the underworld wasn't just about survival, it was about profit, ambition, and a dangerous kind of freedom. By 1929, Joe had become a steady soldier in the Reyna family, and prohibition had turned the streets into gold mines. Bootlegging was the engine that powered the Mafia's rise, and every truckload of whiskey meant another chance at wealth. Joe's crew handled transportation, simple in theory, deadly in execution. They moved crates of Canadian whiskey and homemade gin across borough lines, dodging both police and rival gangs. At night, he'd drive through backroads under moonlight, the hum of the truck mixing with his heartbeat. Every trip was a gamble, one wrong turn, one bad deal, and he could vanish like smoke. But the rewards were undeniable. Money flowed freely. His pockets, once empty, now held thick rolls of cash. He moved his family into a better apartment, dressed in clean suits, and walked the streets with quiet pride. Respect came easily now. Shopkeepers nodded when he passed, waiters hurried to serve him first. In the old days, men like him were invisible. Now, they ruled the city's pulse, its liquor, its music, its vice. Joe found comfort in the rhythm of his work. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Each family controlled certain routes and territories. Payments were made weekly, shipments tracked by memory rather than paper, and everyone knew their place. Joe was meticulous, never late, never careless. His reputation as dependable made him invaluable. The older men began trusting him with more, collecting money, delivering messages between higher-ups, ensuring shipments arrived safely. He had no illusions about what happened to those who failed. In the Mafia, mistakes were rarely forgiven. The bootlegging business was as dangerous as it was profitable. Rival gangs were always hungry, always watching. Trucks were hijacked, drivers disappeared, and betrayals came from unexpected corners. Yet Joe remained steady, his focus unshaken. He wasn't reckless like some of the younger men who sought fame or thrill. For Joe, the work was about discipline. Every night he double-checked routes, timed deliveries, and made sure his men followed orders. Caution was his armor. Still, he couldn't deny the beauty of it all. The city came alive after midnight, glowing like a secret. From his car, he would watch the lines of people waiting outside speakeasies, men in suits, women in feathers and pearls, laughter echoing down narrow alleys. They drank and danced, unaware that the liquor they sipped had passed through a dozen hands, each marked by blood and loyalty. To Joe, it felt almost poetic, chaos wrapped in elegance. He began spending more time in those backroom speakeasies, where the music was soft and the lights dim. Deals were made there, alliances forged with a handshake and a glass of illegal scotch. Joe was careful, speaking little but observing everything. He learned to read the hierarchy, the subtle nods, the coded words, the way power flowed unseen through the room. Behind every cheerful song was tension, and behind every toast, calculation. It was during this period that Joe began to truly feel the weight of loyalty. The Mafia demanded not just silence, but faith. Orders were followed without question, even when they led to violence. Joe participated in collections that turned ugly, in punishments that left him sleepless. Yet he rationalized it, telling himself that this was justice of a different kind, the code of men who lived by their own rules. In this world, betrayal was sin, and loyalty was salvation. Sometimes, he would think back to his father, a man who had labored his entire life for scraps. Joe had found a different kind of work, one that demanded his soul instead of his body. But unlike his father, he was no longer powerless. He could walk into a restaurant and be treated like a king. He could provide for his family, wear tailored suits, and look the world in the eye. That power came with a shadow, though, and deep down, he could feel it growing. The Reyna family prospered under Prohibition. Joe admired Tommy Reyna's leadership, his preference for quiet profits over open conflict. Reyna valued stability. He avoided unnecessary wars, and his men respected that. Joe flourished in such an environment. He became a trusted soldier, known for handling business smoothly, never attracting heat. But as the profits grew, so did envy. Other bosses began eyeing Reyna's territory, whispering about taking control. The peace Joe cherished was slowly turning brittle. The city itself mirrored that tension. Cops were on the take, politicians were being bought, and journalists were beginning to ask questions. The Mafia's empire was invisible but enormous, feeding on America's thirst for forbidden pleasure. Joe sometimes wondered how long it could last. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually collapses. He pushed the thought away and focused on his work. In the Mafia, worrying was dangerous, doing your job was survival. As winter settled over New York, Joe found himself driving more often, hauling barrels of bootleg liquor through icy backroads. One night, as snow drifted across the windshield, he thought about how far he'd come from the boy on Mulberry Street. The danger no longer frightened him, it felt familiar, almost comforting. The hum of the engine, the rhythm of the tires, the cold night air, it was his kind of peace. But beneath the calm surface of the Reyna family, the first cracks were forming. Alliances were shifting, and ambition was beginning to stir among the younger generation of gangsters. Joe didn't see it yet, but change was coming, violent, unpredictable change. For now, he kept his head down, doing what he did best, following orders, making money, and keeping quiet. He had no idea that the golden years of bootlegging were the calm before a storm that would engulf every family in blood. The streets that glimmered under neon lights would soon run red. The men who toasted success in dark bars would soon be turning on one another. And Joe, loyal and steady, would find himself trapped in the middle of a war that would test everything he believed about loyalty, power, and survival. But that was still to come. For now, the music played, the liquor flowed, and the money never stopped. The night belonged to men like Joe Valachi, the silent soldiers who built empires in the dark, never realizing how quickly the darkness would one day swallow them whole. The peace that had once defined the Reyna family began to crumble in the late 1920s. What started as whispers between rival bosses soon grew into open distrust, and before long, the Bronx, once a steady stronghold of business and loyalty, became a battlefield. Joe Valachi, still a loyal soldier, found himself standing in the middle of something far larger and far deadlier than he had ever imagined, a war among men who called themselves brothers. It began quietly. Joe noticed changes in the air, meetings that used to include familiar faces now felt tense, conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, and even small talk carried an edge. He was no fool. He understood that when the air around you grows heavy in this world, blood is never far behind. Tommy Reyna, his boss, had ruled with a calm hand for years, preferring negotiation over violence. But calmness can be mistaken for weakness. Rival families, the Masurias and the Maranzanos, were fighting for dominance over all of New York's criminal operations. To them, Reyna's neutrality made him both a target and an opportunity. In the Bronx taverns, people whispered that Reyna was secretly siding with one of the factions, though no one could say for sure which. To Valachi, it didn't matter. In the Mafia, perception was often deadlier than truth. One night, Joe was called to guard a meeting between Reyna's men and some associates from Brooklyn. It was held in a dark backroom lit by a single bulb that buzzed faintly. The air smelled of damp wood and fear. Joe stood by the door, watching silently as voices rose and tempers flared. Nothing was decided that night, but as the men left, he caught the look in one soldier's eyes, cold, resigned, fatalistic. It was the look of someone who already knew that blood would be spilled soon. The first blow came swiftly. In February 1930, Tommy Reyna was shot in the back of the head while leaving a friend's house, an execution so clean and quiet it shocked even those used to death. Rumors spread that it had been ordered by Joe, the boss, Masuria, one of New York's most powerful mob figures. Reyna's death shattered the delicate peace his family had built. Overnight, the Bronx became a war zone. Joe Valachi felt the loss deeply. Reyna had been more than a boss, he had been a man Joe respected, even admired. For a brief time, Joe considered leaving the life altogether, but there was no leaving now. Once you were in, you stayed in. The Reyna family splintered, some pledging loyalty to the new leader, others seeking revenge. Joe stayed with his old crew, now caught between loyalty and survival. The streets grew darker. Drive-by shootings became common. Names were whispered one week and crossed out the next. Joe learned to move cautiously, never taking the same route twice, never lingering too long in familiar places. The war between Masuria and his Sicilian rival, Salvatore Maranzano, spread across the city. Alliances shifted like sand. Every day brought a new rumor: who switched sides, who disappeared, who would be next. Valachi's crew continued running operations, bootlegging, collections, protection, but the money no longer brought satisfaction. There was no joy in success when death could come from either side. Joe began to feel the first flicker of something he'd never known before: doubt. Was loyalty worth dying for, especially when no one truly knew who was loyal to whom? One evening, he and two of his crew were ambushed while driving a truck through the Bronx. The first bullet shattered the windshield. Joe swerved, ducking low as glass exploded around them. They managed to escape through an alley, hearts pounding, the truck abandoned. That night, Joe sat in silence, staring at his shaking hands. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was betrayal. The enemy wasn't across the river, he could be sitting next to you, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the months that followed, the Reina faction aligned itself with Maranzano's forces. Joe, by extension, found himself part of the Maranzano side of the war. He didn't fully understand the politics, but he followed orders, because orders were the only thing that made sense anymore. The violence escalated. Men he had laughed with a year ago were now lying in gutters, faces unrecognizable. Each funeral felt emptier than the last. The paranoia crept in slowly. Joe started sleeping with a revolver under his pillow, waking at every creak of the floorboards. He trusted no one except his wife, and even she could sense the change in him. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and his once steady hands now trembled when he wasn't on duty. The war was eating at him, not just his safety, but his soul. By late 1931, the Castellammarese War, as it came to be known, reached its bloody climax. Joe's loyalty had kept him alive, but barely. When Joe Masuria was finally killed in a Coney Island restaurant, orchestrated by Lucky Luciano and other ambitious young mobsters, the old order crumbled. Maranzano declared himself the new boss of bosses, the capo di tutti capi. The city exhaled in exhausted relief. Valachi survived, but the experience left scars. He had seen too much: friends turning on friends, men executed for rumors, loyalty reduced to ashes. The war had taught him one brutal truth: in the Mafia, family was only sacred until power was at stake. The Reina family he once served with pride was gone, replaced by shifting alliances and new faces. He had survived, yes, but survival had its own price. When Joe walked through the Bronx now, the streets felt emptier. The same corners where laughter once echoed were now silent. The old codes of honor that once seemed so strong felt hollow. The Mafia had changed, and so had he. He was harder now, quieter, stripped of illusion. Yet, even as he tried to steady himself, Joe couldn't shake the memory of Reina's calm face, of that era when the family still meant something. That world was gone forever, replaced by one ruled by cunning and fear. The betrayal that had killed his first boss had also killed a part of him. But there was no time for mourning in this life. He kept moving forward, because in the underworld, movement was survival. Still, somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder if all of this, the power, the money, the so-called brotherhood, was worth the blood that stained every dollar he earned. He didn't have an answer yet. But he would, one day, when loyalty itself would turn against him. The year 1931 brought with it a strange kind of calm, a silence after the storm. The Castellammarese War was over, its casualties buried beneath the city's restless rhythm. From that bloodshed rose a new order, one that would redefine organized crime in America for decades to come. For Joe Valachi, now a hardened survivor, it marked the beginning of his life under the reign of a man who would become both his leader and, eventually, his undoing, Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Luciano's vision was different from that of the old Sicilian bosses. Where they ruled with tradition and superstition, he ruled with structure and logic. He saw the Mafia not as a cluster of families bound by emotion, but as a corporation built on business. He abolished the title Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses, and replaced it with a new governing body, the Commission. Each major family would have a seat, and disputes would be settled through reason, not war. It was an empire run like an institution, and it needed soldiers who understood discipline. Joe fit perfectly into that mold. After Maranzano's assassination, a coup orchestrated by Luciano's men disguised as government agents, the underworld shifted overnight. Old loyalties were erased, old hierarchies dissolved. Joe's own crew, remnants of the Reina family, found themselves absorbed into the newly formed Luciano organization, which would later become known as the Genovese family. It was a quiet transition, and Joe, ever adaptable, went where the orders told him. For him, survival meant obedience. The Luciano years were unlike anything Joe had seen before. The new system was efficient, precise, almost clinical in its operations. There were no open wars, no reckless killings. Business came first: bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, and construction kickbacks. The Mafia had gone corporate, and Joe was a mid-level employee in the most powerful criminal corporation in America. He remembered the first time he met Lucky Luciano in person, a brief encounter, but one that stayed with him. Luciano was charming, confident, and frighteningly composed. He smiled easily, but his eyes gave nothing away. Loyalty, Luciano said softly to the room, isn't about love. It's about trust. And trust, you earn it every day. Those words stuck in Joe's mind. They were simple, but they carried weight. Luciano's charisma commanded both respect and fear. He was everything the old bosses weren't: modern, visionary, and utterly ruthless when necessary. Joe worked under men like Tommy Gagliano and Gaetano Tommy Lucchese, who managed day-to-day operations with precision. He handled collections, supervised bookmaking spots, and ensured payments reached the top without trouble. The atmosphere in the organization had changed. Gone were the fiery tempers and impulsive orders. Everything was planned, documented, at least in memory. If violence was needed, it was swift, silent, and efficient. For the first time, Joe felt stability. He wasn't looking over his shoulder every day, he wasn't fighting for survival. There was a sense of professionalism in the new Mafia, a quiet pride in how seamlessly they operated beneath society's surface. Politicians were on the payroll, judges were friendly, and even police captains knew when to look the other way. The system worked like clockwork. And yet, for all its sophistication, the underworld still demanded total submission. The Commission's rules were absolute. If you disobeyed or betrayed, there were no second chances. Joe had seen enough bodies disappear to know better than to question anything. But he admired the system, even respected it. In his eyes, it was proof that the Mafia could evolve, that it wasn't just chaos, it was order in disguise. During these years, Joe's operations expanded. He managed gambling rings across the Bronx and Brooklyn, ensuring profits flowed upward. His name carried quiet respect. He was known as a man who followed orders, never asked questions, and delivered results. That made him valuable, but it also made him invisible. In the Mafia, visibility was dangerous. The higher your profile, the shorter your life expectancy. Joe preferred it this way. At night, when he drove through the city, he often marveled at how different the world seemed. The same streets that once echoed with gunfire now pulsed with life and opportunity. Nightclubs were full, speakeasies thrived, and even legitimate businesses quietly partnered with mob-controlled unions. It felt as though the Mafia had woven itself into the city's very fabric. You couldn't tell where legality ended and crime began. Still, Joe noticed a change in himself. The years of blood and betrayal had hardened him. He was no longer the idealistic soldier who saw honor in loyalty. He had learned that loyalty was currency, valuable only as long as it benefited those in power. Yet, even knowing that, he stayed loyal. In this life, habit was stronger than truth. The Luciano organization grew stronger each year, and with that strength came new ventures. The end of Prohibition in 1933 forced the Mafia to diversify, into narcotics, unions, and legitimate businesses. Joe found himself managing parts of the numbers racket again, a familiar world of figures, bets, and backroom deals. He liked the predictability of it, the calm rhythm of money flowing in, money flowing out. Violence became rare, almost ceremonial, reserved for those who broke the rules. And yet, beneath that calm surface, shadows were gathering again. Power never stayed still for long. When Luciano was arrested in 1936 on charges of running a prostitution ring, the empire shifted once more. Control passed to his underboss, Vito Genovese, a man whose charm was colder, whose ambitions far darker. Joe didn't know it yet, but Genovese would become the defining figure of his life, the man whose paranoia and cruelty would eventually drive him to betrayal. For now, though, Joe simply did what he always did, his job. The new order had brought him safety, purpose, and a steady living. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that the chaos of the past was gone for good. The Mafia had become smarter, cleaner, more controlled. The wars were over, he told himself. The family was strong again. But in the world Joe lived in, peace was never permanent, it was only the silence before the next storm. The Luciano Revolution had changed the Mafia structure, yes, but it hadn't changed its soul. Beneath the polished surface of meetings and ledgers, the old instincts still lived, greed, jealousy, revenge. They were waiting, like embers under ash, for someone to stir them back to life. And when that happened, Joe Valachi would once again find himself standing in the middle of it, caught between loyalty and survival, between the old ways and the new. The revolution had saved him for now, but its legacy would one day lead him straight into the hands of the man who would destroy him. The 1930s settled over New York like a gray winter coat, quiet, heavy, and watchful. For Joe Valachi, this was a time of uneasy peace, a decade where the city's heartbeat slowed but never truly rested. The blood and chaos of the Castellamarese War had faded into memory, replaced by something colder and more disciplined. The Luciano organization, now reorganized under Vito Genovese's influence, had become a fortress of order. Inside that structure, Joe found his rhythm. He was no longer just a foot soldier running errands, he was a reliable cog in a perfectly oiled machine. He had learned the art of invisibility, how to be seen without being noticed, how to exist in a world where speaking too much could mean your end. His days were simple in pattern but complex in meaning. He collected envelopes, ran numbers, supervised small gambling dens, and made sure payments were delivered to the right hands. There was nothing glamorous about it, but there was security. In a world built on betrayal, predictability was a rare kind of luxury. The Mafia was changing. Under Luciano's earlier reforms, and now under Genovese's growing shadow, the organization had become a business built on silence and obedience. Soldiers like Joe weren't expected to dream or question, they were expected to execute. Orders came down from capos like whispers from the gods, and they were obeyed without hesitation. That was the code, the sacred structure that defined La Cosa Nostra. Joe believed in that code. It gave his life meaning, a sense of purpose beyond the randomness of the streets. The rules were simple: never lie to your family, never steal from your family, never betray your family. In a strange way, it was moral clarity in an immoral world. He'd seen what happened to those who broke it. Sometimes it was quick, a bullet behind the ear. Other times, it was slower, ostracism, fear, the slow erasure of one's name. He prided himself on discipline. While others got drunk, bragged, or flaunted their money, Joe stayed quiet. He didn't gamble with his own cash, didn't chase showgirls, didn't draw attention. He lived in modest comfort with his wife, Mildred, and tried to keep his business separate from his home life. At night, when the city quieted, he would sit by the window smoking a cigarette, thinking about the strange balance he had built, half criminal, half family man. The underworld respected men like him. Valachi's solid, they would say. You can trust him. That kind of reputation was worth more than money. In an empire run on paranoia, trust was the rarest currency. Joe's reliability made him invisible to the bosses in the best possible way. He was too useful to lose, too quiet to fear. There was comfort in the structure. Meetings were held at the same places, payments made at the same times. Everything was routine. The world outside, politics, poverty, even the Great Depression, barely touched them. While America struggled, the Mafia thrived. The poor gambled more, drank more, borrowed more, and the families profited quietly. Joe watched as the organization expanded into new areas: construction, unions, restaurants, and even legitimate businesses. They owned everything from garbage routes to bakeries. It was a quiet empire built on control. But beneath that calm surface, Joe sometimes felt an unease he couldn't name. He'd lived through too many wars to believe in true peace. He noticed the small cracks, the arguments between soldiers, the sudden disappearances of familiar faces, the growing influence of men like Genovese whose ambition had no ceiling. Still, he kept those thoughts to himself. The code demanded silence not just about crimes, but about doubts. His loyalty was not rooted in love, it was rooted in necessity. The Mafia was not a choice anymore, it was the air he breathed. To leave would be unthinkable. To betray would be suicidal. So he followed the only rule that truly mattered: stay useful, stay quiet, stay alive. Every morning, Joe woke before dawn, his routine almost ritualistic. He would dress carefully: pressed shirt, polished shoes, jacket with no wrinkles. He looked respectable, almost ordinary. To anyone passing him on the street, he might seem like a clerk or a small businessman. And in a way, he was. The Mafia wasn't chaos anymore, it was administration, management. Structure. Joe's work kept the gears turning. He liked the predictability, but it came with a price. The more efficient the system became, the more human warmth drained from it. The brotherhood that once felt genuine during the Reina years now felt mechanical, a chain of command rather than a circle of loyalty. Joe still called the men around him brothers, but the word had lost its meaning. He trusted no one completely, not even those he dined with. He had seen too many smiles disappear overnight. The world outside the Mafia was shifting too. America was recovering from depression, and prohibition was over. The easy money from bootlegging had dried up, forcing the organization to evolve again. The focus turned to gambling, narcotics, and extortion. Joe didn't like the narcotics trade, it was unpredictable, and the sentences were harsh, but he knew better than to question it. Orders were orders. He handled collections, made deliveries, and kept his head down. He found a strange satisfaction in the discipline. There was beauty in routine, the same streets, the same faces, the same quiet nods of acknowledgement. Even fear, when familiar, can be comforting. But the stillness began to eat at him. He was a man of order trapped in a world of secrets, and the more stable things seemed, the more he sensed something simmering underneath. Sometimes, late at night, he would think about the men he'd known in his early days, wild, passionate, reckless men who fought for pride as much as for profit. Most were dead now. The new generation was colder, calculating, without sentiment. Joe missed the old ways, even if they were bloody. There had been something human in that chaos. Now everything was business, numbers, meetings, silence. The Mafia had become its own machine, and Joe was proud to be part of it, but he was also its prisoner. He didn't see it that way yet. He believed he was living by honor, that obedience and discipline kept him safe. But what he didn't realize was that those same virtues would one day make him the perfect victim. His world was tightening around him slowly, like the careful winding of a clock. Each act of loyalty, each day of obedience, bound him tighter to a system that would never let him go. The code he believed in so fiercely would one day turn its cold gaze upon him, and demand from him the same silence he had once used to survive. For now, though, he slept peacefully. The city outside whispered as always, sirens in the distance, laughter from late-night bars, the occasional echo of a car door slamming shut. Joe believed he understood the game. He believed the code would protect him, as long as he never broke it. He didn't yet know that the code would become his curse, that loyalty could become a noose. In those quiet years, Joe Valachi perfected the role of the loyal soldier, the man who never asked, never doubted, never betrayed. The Mafia, in its new, corporate form, was stronger than ever. But like all great machines built on fear, it would one day begin to devour itself. And when it did, men like Joe, disciplined, silent, and faithful, would be the first to fall into its gears. By the mid-1930s, Joe Valachi had achieved something few men in his world ever managed, a life that balanced crime and normalcy. On the surface, his world was stable. He had money in his pocket, respect among his peers, and for the first time, a sense of peace at home. The streets still whispered with danger, yes, but inside his modest Bronx apartment, there was quiet. There was warmth. And at the center of it all was a woman who would become both his solace and his sorrow, Mildred Bellino. Mildred was unlike anyone Joe had ever known. She was calm, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a grace that reminded him of the life he had never lived, a life untouched by crime. She came from a family with deep ties to the Mafia world, yet she seemed untouched by its poison. Her uncle, Dominic, the Gap, Petrilli, was a respected member of the Genovese family, and her connections gave Joe both comfort and risk. When he met her, he felt something rare, acceptance without judgment. She knew who he was, what he did, and she didn't flinch. Their courtship was quiet and simple. Joe would take her to small Italian restaurants in the Bronx, where they'd sit in corner booths, the low light making the world feel safe. She'd laugh softly at his stories, and for a few hours, the life he lived outside those walls disappeared. He wasn't a soldier, a collector, or a criminal, he was just a man in love. For a man like Joe, that illusion was powerful. They married in 1932. The ceremony was modest, attended mostly by family and a few friends of the family. There were smiles, handshakes, and toasts made with the same men who would order executions the next day. But on that night, none of that mattered. Joe stood beside Mildred, promising to be a good husband, to protect her, to build something lasting. He believed it. Maybe for the first time in his life, he truly believed something good could come from the world he lived in. Married life changed him in small but noticeable ways. He began spending more evenings at home, eating dinner with Mildred, listening to the radio instead of sitting in smoky backrooms. He tried to shield her from the darker parts of his world. When she asked about his work, he'd say only that he handled business for the company. She didn't push him. Perhaps she understood that silence was safer than truth. Still, the double life wore on him. By day, he was a husband, neat and polite, taking care of errands, helping neighbors fix their cars, smiling at children on the street. By night, he returned to the shadows, meetings, collections, payoffs, the occasional enforcement. There was always a moment, as he put on his overcoat and reached for his hat, when Mildred would watch him from the doorway, worry written across her face. "Be careful," she'd say softly. And every night, Joe would give the same calm reply, always. He meant it. He wasn't reckless like some of the younger men who sought power through violence. He believed in caution, in control. But no amount of discipline could erase the danger. The underworld had a way of creeping into everything, even love. At first, the balance worked. His home was a sanctuary, his job a necessity. He told himself he was providing for his family, that he'd never be one of those men who brought trouble to his doorstep. But trouble had its own rules. It arrived quietly, like a draft through a closed window. One night, Joe came home later than usual. Mildred was waiting up, her face pale with worry. There had been a killing that evening, a man Joe knew, gunned down in a restaurant not far from where they lived. The name was already on the radio. Mildred asked if he knew anything about it. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just business," he muttered. She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to see the truth behind his eyes. From that night on, something in her changed. The silences between them grew longer. Joe didn't blame her. He could feel the same heaviness settling in his own heart. No matter how carefully he tried to separate his two worlds, they were starting to overlap. He began noticing the paranoia that followed him home, the way he checked the street before entering his building, the way he sat facing the door during dinner. Mildred saw it too. She never said it out loud, but she knew he was slipping deeper into something he couldn't control. There were moments of peace, quiet Sundays when they'd visit her relatives, long drives upstate to breathe fresh air, or evenings spent listening to Sinatra records as the city lights flickered outside their window. Those moments were real, but fleeting. Joe cherished them because he sensed, deep down, that his world wasn't built to allow happiness for long. The men he worked with often joked about marriage. "You can't mix the streets with a home," one of them told him over drinks. "Sooner or later, one ruins the other." Joe had laughed it off, but in private, the words haunted him. He didn't want to believe them. He wanted to believe he could keep the darkness confined to his work, that it wouldn't touch the woman who had brought light into his life. But the Mafia had a way of consuming everything its men loved. In the years that followed, Joe's role in the organization grew. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a dependable middleman, someone trusted to handle delicate business. The more successful he became, the less time he had for home. Nights turned into early mornings. Conversations with Mildred became shorter, her eyes sadder. He could see the toll it took, but he didn't know how to stop. The Mafia didn't give men choices, it gave them obligations. And yet, despite the growing distance, Mildred never left him. She stood by him through every late night, every unexplained absence, every flicker of fear. Sometimes Joe would look at her and wonder why. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was the same thing that bound him to his world, the inability to walk away once you were too deep inside it. By the end of the decade, the illusion of control began to fade. Joe could no longer tell where his business life ended and his personal one began. The laughter in his home grew quieter, the air heavier. The weight of secrets pressed down on him like stone. He still kissed his wife goodbye each morning, still promised to come home safely each night. But each promise carried less certainty than the last. Joe had entered this life searching for belonging. He had found it in the family, then again in love. But both were beginning to slip away, replaced by something colder, routine, suspicion, and a slow erosion of peace. He didn't know it yet, but the life he was so carefully maintaining was already beginning to crack. The walls he had built between his two worlds were paper-thin, and soon, they would collapse under the pressure of betrayal, paranoia, and fate. For now, though, he still clung to the illusion. He told himself he could keep both worlds alive, one built on crime, the other on tenderness. But in the world Joe Valachi lived in, such balance never lasted. The streets always collected their debt, and when they did, they took more than money. They took the soul. The rain fell hard over New York that night, turning the streets into mirrors of light and shadow. For Joe Valachi, those years after his marriage marked a quiet descent into a darker world, one where the past refused to stay buried and every shadow carried the echo of a gunshot. The old wars were supposed to be over, the city rebuilt under a new order, but the ghosts of the Castellamarese war lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. In the 1930s, Joe found himself haunted, not just by the men he had lost, but by what he had become. He'd always told himself he was a soldier, not a killer. That the blood spilled in the streets was just business, that the men who died had broken the code. But as the years passed, that line between duty and murder blurred until it was almost invisible. In the still hours of the night, when even the city seemed to hold its breath, Joe would remember the faces of those he had helped silence, the glint of fear in their eyes, the way time seemed to slow in those final seconds before the world went quiet. He tried to push those thoughts away, but they followed him, lingering behind every calm routine of his day. The Castellammarese War had changed everything. It wasn't just a war between families, it was a war between eras. The old bosses, the ones who ruled by tradition, respect, and Sicilian pride, had been replaced by younger men who ruled by profit. Lucky Luciano's reforms had brought structure, but they had also brought distance. There was no longer the illusion of honor, only efficiency. Joe felt that shift deeply. The Mafia he had joined as a young man was gone. In its place stood a machine that cared for no one, not even its most loyal soldiers. He often thought about Tommy Reyna, his first real boss, the quiet, dignified man who had believed that peace could exist in their world. Reyna's death had marked the end of that innocence. It had taught Joe that survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant silence. Yet even now, years later, Joe couldn't escape the memory of those early nights, the rain-soaked alleyways, the whispers of betrayal, the first time he saw a friend's body lying cold in the gutter. He remembered how he had turned away, forcing himself not to look too long, as if refusing to see could erase what had been done. Every so often, Joe was ordered to carry out messages. That was the polite word they used, a message. Sometimes it meant delivering money, sometimes it meant delivering death. The orders came from above, always filtered through intermediaries so no one could point to a single man. Joe never asked questions. He had learned long ago that asking questions was the quickest way to disappear. One job in particular stayed with him. It was a cold night in 1934. Joe and two other soldiers were sent to pick up a man who had gone bad, a low-level bookmaker who had stolen from the wrong people. The man begged, promised to return the money, to make things right. Joe didn't speak. He just did what he was told. Later, when the sound of gunfire faded and the only noise left was the wind, Joe looked down at the body and realized something that chilled him to the core. He felt nothing. Not guilt, not satisfaction, just emptiness. It was in that silence that he understood how deeply the life had shaped him. He told himself that it was the price of loyalty, that every soldier carried ghosts. But sometimes, when he came home and saw Mildred asleep beside him, he wondered what kind of man she thought she had married. Did she know the truth? Did she see the blood in his eyes even when he tried to hide it? He started sleeping less, haunted by dreams of men's faces flashing in and out of darkness. The underworld had changed since those war years. Luciano's rise had brought stability, but it also created new tensions beneath the surface. The families were stronger than ever, but they were also colder, greedier. Joe found himself working under new capos, men who had no memory of the old wars, no sense of gratitude for the men who had fought them. They treated the older generation like relics, tools that could be used until they broke. Joe, though still respected, felt that shift keenly. He was part of the old guard now, even if he didn't realize it. The city, too, had changed. The jazz and glamour of the Roaring Twenties had given way to a quieter, heavier mood. The Great Depression still lingered in the air. People were desperate, hungry, willing to gamble their last dollar in the hopes of winning a better life. Joe managed several numbers operations during this time, illegal lotteries that thrived on desperation. He was efficient, polite, never rough with customers. The people in the neighborhoods trusted him, even liked him. They called him Mr. Joe. To them, he wasn't a gangster. He was a provider, a familiar face who brought excitement to otherwise bleak days. But underneath the calm, Joe felt the pressure building again. He could sense another storm coming, the kind of shift that always brought blood. The bosses were changing, alliances were shifting, and Vito Genovese's influence was growing. Joe didn't know it yet, but his loyalty to that man would one day destroy him. In those years, Joe often found himself driving alone through the city at night. The streets were nearly empty, the streetlights glowing dimly in the fog. He liked those drives. They gave him time to think, though his thoughts were rarely comforting. Sometimes he imagined he could hear the ghosts of old friends in the hum of the tires, voices from a world that no longer existed. The Mafia wasn't built for nostalgia, it was built for survival. But in Joe's heart, he still carried a strange, weary longing for the past. He remembered one evening when a young soldier, nervous, eager, too green for the job, asked him, "Do you ever get used to it, Joe? The killing?" Joe had looked at him quietly for a long moment before answering. "You don't get used to it," he said. "You just stop thinking about it." That was the truth. The Mafia didn't take your life all at once, it took it piece by piece. Each act of obedience stripped away a bit more of your soul, until nothing was left but habit and silence. Joe had become that silence. He moved, spoke, ate, worked, but inside, something essential had gone still. Yet even in that stillness, part of him longed for redemption. He didn't know what form it would take, or if such a thing even existed for men like him. But every time he passed the church near his home, he found himself pausing for just a moment. He never went inside. He just stood there, listening to the faint sound of bells, remembering his mother's prayers from long ago. Then he'd turn away and continue walking, back toward the life that owned him. The years ahead would only grow darker. Joe didn't know it yet, but his discipline, the very thing that had kept him alive, would one day become the weapon used against him. The ghosts of the past were not finished with him. They were waiting patiently, watching from the corners of his mind. And when the time came, they would remind him that no one in this world ever truly escapes their own sins. The first time Joe Valachi saw the inside of a prison cell, it wasn't through panic or surprise, it was through resignation. By the late 1930s, after years of quiet work under the Genovese organization, prison was almost a rite of passage. Every soldier knew that eventually, you took a fall for the family. You went in, kept your mouth shut, did your time, and came out stronger. Loyalty wasn't just proven in blood, it was proven in silence behind bars. When the police finally came for him, Joe didn't resist. It was a minor charge, something connected to gambling operations, a technical violation that barely scratched the surface of what he actually did. The men above him made sure the case was narrow. The system worked best when everyone played their part. The bosses stayed clean, the lawyers handled the rest, and the soldiers served their time without complaint. Joe knew the routine. He shook hands with the arresting officers as if it were just another day's business. The cell was small and cold, its walls covered in faint scratches left by the ghosts of men who'd been there before him. Prison had a rhythm of its own, a grim clock that ticked not with time, but with habits. Mornings were for roll call, afternoons for labor, nights for memory. Joe learned quickly that respect was earned the same way inside as outside, with silence and strength. He kept to himself, made no enemies, and never spoke of his business. What surprised him most was how much the Mafia's reach extended even here. Behind bars, the same rules applied. The same hierarchy existed, invisible but absolute. There were men who carried messages, men who collected favors, and men who ensured that loyalty never wavered. A soldier might lose his freedom, but never his rank. Joe soon realized that prison was just another branch of the family, one where the code mattered more than ever. He watched carefully, as he always did. Some inmates bragged about their crimes, talking too loudly in the yard or boasting to guards who listened too closely. Joe found that foolish. The ones who survived longest were those who acted like ghosts. He followed the old Italian saying his father once used to repeat, "A closed mouth catches no flies." At night, in his bunk, Joe would lie awake listening to the sounds of the cell block, the metallic clang of doors, the whispers through pipes, the occasional shout that cut through the dark. He thought of Mildred, of the small apartment they had made into a home, of her waiting for letters that said almost nothing. He couldn't tell her what prison really felt like, the weight of the air, the smell of iron and sweat, the endless monotony that made days blur into each other. So he wrote instead about the weather, about books he pretended to read, about how he'd be home soon. He missed her terribly, but there was also a strange comfort in the isolation. For once, no one demanded anything from him. The endless tension of the streets, the fear of betrayal, it was muted here. The walls, though cold, were honest. You knew where the threats were, and you knew who you could trust. There were no illusions. Within a few weeks, Joe had found his place in the prison's quiet hierarchy. He handled errands for the older Mafia inmates, passed notes written in code, and settled disputes without violence. His composure earned respect from both guards and prisoners. Some of the younger men sought his advice, asking how to survive when released, how to stay in favor with the families. Joe spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. "Keep your word," he'd say softly. "That's all that keeps you alive." It was during this first prison stretch that Joe truly came to understand how deep the Mafia's roots went. He saw lawyers carrying messages between bosses and inmates, politicians visiting old friends behind closed doors, guards accepting envelopes with quiet nods. The organization was everywhere, an invisible network that stretched from the streets to the cells, from the courtrooms to the Capitol. It made Joe both proud and uneasy. There was power in belonging to something so vast, but also helplessness. No man, not even the bosses, could ever really leave it. Sometimes, when the lights went out, Joe's thoughts turned darker. He remembered the faces of the men he had helped bury in the name of loyalty, the lives he had watched crumble. Prison gave him time to think, and thinking was dangerous. He tried to remind himself that this was temporary, that as long as he stayed silent, the family would protect him when he got out. Still, there were nights when the silence felt like punishment, not protection. One afternoon, while working in the prison kitchen, Joe overheard two inmates talking about him. One said, "That Valachi, he's old school. Doesn't talk, doesn't flinch. Guys like him, they don't make any more." Joe pretended not to hear, but the word stayed with him. Old school. It was meant as a compliment, but it carried the sting of truth. The world was changing outside these walls, and he wasn't sure if there would still be a place for men like him when he returned. Months turned into years. Joe marked time not by seasons but by the shifting faces of guards and inmates. Occasionally, a name from the outside world would drift in, a murder, an arrest, a new boss taking control. Each bit of news reminded him that the life continued without him. The family never stopped moving. A soldier in prison was easily replaced, easily forgotten. When his release finally came, it was quiet. No celebration, no promises. A car waited for him outside, driven by a man he didn't recognize. The family had arranged everything, as they always did. Inside the car was an envelope, cash, instructions, and a message: "Keep your head down. Welcome home." As the city skyline came into view, Joe felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He was free, but not really. Prison had shown him the truth, that the walls he had just left were not made of stone, but of loyalty. They existed everywhere he went. That night, back in his apartment, Mildred held him tightly. He said nothing about what he'd seen, about the quiet dread that had taken root inside him. She cried softly, and he let her, pretending the tears washed away the years between them. But deep down, he knew something fundamental had changed. Prison hadn't broken him, it had reshaped him. The discipline that had once been his strength had hardened into something colder. He had learned to suppress everything: fear, guilt, compassion, until all that remained was duty. He had become the perfect soldier, not because he wanted to be, but because there was nothing else left. He looked out the window that night, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and realized that freedom in his world was an illusion. The family owned him, body and soul. The cell door had closed, but the code still held the key. And somewhere inside him, a quiet voice whispered what he refused to say out loud: "One day, this loyalty will kill you." When Joe Valachi came out of prison, the world he stepped back into wasn't the same one he had left behind. The faces were different, the alliances had shifted, and the man sitting on the throne of power was Vito Genovese. To the outside world, Genovese was just another mob boss, but to those inside the family, he was something far more complex, intelligent, ambitious, and frighteningly cold. For Joe, aligning himself with Genovese felt natural at first, almost inevitable. After all, the man commanded respect from everyone, and loyalty to him meant survival. Yet what Joe didn't realize then was that the bond between them would become the most dangerous of his life, a connection built on fear, deceit, and the slow erosion of trust. Genovese had always been different. Where Luciano was polished and calculating, Genovese was quiet and predatory, like a snake watching its prey. His charisma wasn't warm, it was magnetic in the way fire is, beautiful from afar, deadly up close. By the late 1930s, with Luciano imprisoned and the balance of power shifting, Genovese seized control of the family's operations. Joe, recently released and eager to prove himself useful again, found himself absorbed into Genovese's inner circle through his old contacts in the Bronx. At first, Joe admired him. Genovese was a man who understood discipline and results. He didn't tolerate chaos or showmanship. He rewarded men who worked efficiently, who didn't talk, who didn't draw attention. For someone like Joe, steady, silent, dutiful, it felt like a perfect match. Genovese's operations were vast: narcotics trafficking, gambling, labor racketeering, and legitimate fronts that made millions. Joe was placed under the command of trusted lieutenants and quickly began running gambling and loan sharking operations in the Bronx and Manhattan. The money flowed, and for a while, Joe's life regained its rhythm. He had influence again, and with that came a renewed sense of pride. He bought a better car, moved into a slightly larger home, and even treated Mildred to dinners she never thought they could afford. The surface was smooth, almost serene. But underneath, the air around Genovese was heavy with something poisonous: paranoia. Genovese didn't trust easily. He watched everyone, weighed every word, analyzed every gesture. To him, loyalty was a performance, not a virtue. He kept his men close but never let them forget who held the power. Those who pleased him rose quickly, but those who disappointed him, disappeared quietly. Joe noticed this early on. He saw how men who once dined beside Genovese could vanish overnight, their names never spoken again. It was the Mafia's way of erasing memory itself. Still, Joe remained loyal. He did his job, followed orders, kept his head down. His reputation as reliable and calm earned him Genovese's approval. The boss began to use him more often for delicate tasks: collections, negotiations, deliveries where silence and precision were paramount. Joe took pride in that trust, though part of him knew it was the kind of trust that could turn lethal if mishandled. As the 1940s dawned, the Mafia entered its golden age. War in Europe had opened new opportunities for smuggling and supply rackets. The families profited from every corner of industry, from shipping to construction to the black market. Joe's world expanded along with it. He attended meetings at restaurants where linen tablecloths couldn't hide the tension beneath the chatter. The Mafia was cleaner now, more sophisticated, but no less deadly. Joe had learned that power wore many disguises: sometimes it came with gold cufflinks, sometimes with a smile. During those years, Genovese's influence spread like oil across water. His reach extended into every borough and every racket. He had allies in law enforcement, judges on his payroll, and informants everywhere. Joe admired that control, even envied it. Yet he also began to feel its weight pressing on him. The closer he got to Genovese, the more he realized that trust in this world was just another kind of weapon. Genovese was not a man who forgave weakness. He tested his men constantly, watching how they handled fear. Once, Joe was summoned to a meeting in a dim restaurant backroom. He didn't know why. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Genovese sat at the far end of the table, his face unreadable. "You've been with us a long time, Joe," he said slowly. "That means something. But loyalty, true loyalty, has to be tested. You understand?" Joe nodded, unsure where the conversation was going. "Good," Genovese continued, "because I don't like surprises." Nothing came of that meeting, at least not immediately. But Joe left it with a chill that never quite left him. He understood what wasn't being said, one mistake, one whisper out of place, and he'd be the next man erased from memory. Despite the tension, Joe worked harder than ever. He became a key earner for the family, managing multiple operations with clockwork precision. The money was good, the bosses were pleased, and yet he felt a growing unease, a quiet awareness that his loyalty was now both his armor and his cage. At home, Mildred noticed the change. He was quieter, more distracted. Sometimes she'd catch him staring off into space, lost in thought. When she asked what was wrong, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just business." But in his mind, he was constantly calculating, who was loyal, who wasn't, what rumors might be circulating, who might be talking to the feds. Paranoia had begun to seep into his bones. Then came the whispers, small at first, then louder. Some men in the organization had started dealing in narcotics, a dangerous move that drew federal attention. Joe wanted no part of it. He had seen what happened to men caught with drugs, the sentences were longer, the risks higher, and the scrutiny relentless. But Genovese saw narcotics as the future, a fortune waiting to be seized. Joe followed orders, but uneasily. He handled shipments, managed drop-offs, ensured the money flowed, but every time he touched that side of the business, he felt the law's eyes watching. By the early 1950s, the landscape of organized crime had changed once again. Law enforcement was beginning to take notice of the Mafia's vast reach. The FBI, once dismissive of the Cosa Nostra myth, had started to connect the dots. Names like Genovese, Lucchese, and Costello were being whispered in Senate hearings. For the first time, the underworld's secrets were bleeding into daylight. Joe sensed the shift before most. He could feel it in the air, the unease in meetings, the guarded tones in conversations, the way everyone suddenly seemed to be watching everyone else. Genovese, in particular, grew colder, more suspicious. His paranoia deepened to obsession. He began accusing trusted men of betrayal, sometimes without evidence. A simple rumor could mean death. Joe tried to stay invisible, but it was impossible to hide forever. His years of loyalty, once a source of pride, now made him visible. Men like Genovese didn't trust those who had been around too long, they knew too much. Joe could sense that something inevitable was coming, though he didn't yet know from where. In those years, he slept less, his dreams filled with fragments of his past, the faces of men he'd served, men he'd killed, men who had vanished. Sometimes he wondered how long before he joined them. The streets outside his window no longer felt like home. Even the familiar hum of the city carried a weight now, a reminder that everything he'd built was resting on silence. The bond between Joe Valachi and Vito Genovese had begun as mutual respect, but over time, it became something darker, a thread of fear that tightened with every passing year. Genovese was a man who built empires out of loyalty and then destroyed those same empires when his paranoia took hold. Joe didn't know it yet, but that same paranoia would one day turn directly on him, trapping him in a nightmare of suspicion, betrayal, and blood. For now, he kept working, earning, and pretending everything was fine. But deep down, something had changed forever. The code of silence that once gave his life meaning now felt like a chain around his neck. He had spent his entire life proving his loyalty, and soon, that loyalty would be the very thing that condemned him. By the time the 1950s arrived, the Mafia was no longer the shadowy secret it once was, it had become a quiet empire, woven seamlessly into the fabric of American life. Politicians were bought, unions were controlled, and fortunes were built behind closed doors. The headlines talked about prosperity, but the real story was power: who had it, who was losing it, and who was willing to kill to keep it. And deep within this new, polished world of organized crime, Joe Valachi found himself caught between loyalty and fear, drawn into one of the darkest ventures the Mafia ever touched: narcotics. Joe had always preferred the old ways: gambling, bookmaking, extortion. Those were controllable, predictable trades. You could calculate the risk. Drugs were different. They were unpredictable, dangerous, and drew too much attention. But Vito Genovese didn't care about risk. He saw heroin and cocaine as the future, the new gold of the underworld. With America's appetite for escape growing after the war, the profits were astronomical. The narcotics pipeline stretched from Europe to New York, and the Genovese family sat at its center. Whether Joe liked it or not, he was now part of it. At first, his role was minor. He moved money, oversaw shipments disguised as legitimate imports, and made sure payments went to the right people. The deals were done in whispers, in warehouses at night, in the backs of trucks parked in empty lots, in cafes where laughter disguised danger. The work paid well, but it came with a shadow that never left him. Joe could feel it following him, pressing against his back whenever he looked over his shoulder. This wasn't the same world he had known in the 1930s. The stakes were higher now. The rules were thinner. And the men were colder. The old Mafia had once pretended to hold itself above drugs. It was an illusion, of course, but a comforting one. "We don't touch that poison," the elders used to say, claiming moral distance from the chaos drugs brought. But Genovese shattered that illusion. He didn't just tolerate the trade, he embraced it, investing heavily in narcotics distribution networks that stretched through ports, ships, and street dealers. Joe, as always, obeyed. But obedience now felt like complicity in something that would one day destroy them all. In those years, paranoia became Joe's constant companion. He could sense the FBI closing in. There were whispers about investigations, about surveillance, about men being picked up and questioned. The word informant carried the weight of death. Joe followed the code: never talk, never write, never trust, but even he could feel the net tightening. Still, life on the surface continued as normal. He was in his 40s now, older, quieter, but still respected. Younger soldiers looked up to him as a man who had survived when others hadn't. He carried himself with calm authority, never loud, never careless. But inside, he was tired. He had lived his whole life for the Mafia, and the rewards now felt hollow. Money was no longer exciting, it was a necessity. Power no longer thrilled him, it scared him. Mildred saw the change. She noticed the nights he came home later and later, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he locked the doors twice before bed. She asked what was wrong, and he gave the same answer every time: "Nothing you need to worry about." But she knew. She could see the fear in his eyes. The man who once walked with quiet confidence now moved like someone always expecting to be followed. There was reason for it. The Mafia had entered an age of suspicion. Informants were becoming more common, and the FBI was beginning to understand the structure of La Cosa Nostra thanks to undercover work and new laws. Genovese himself had fled to Italy years earlier to escape prosecution and only recently returned, more powerful, and more paranoid than ever. Every man around him was under scrutiny. Every friendship was questioned. Loyalty had become a dangerous word. Joe continued handling narcotics shipments through the Bronx and New Jersey, overseeing the distribution networks that linked dockworkers, couriers, and mid-level dealers. The profits were immense, but so were the risks. He heard of men being arrested, names whispered in interrogation rooms, indictments piling up in federal offices. Still, Genovese pushed harder. "The money is worth it," he would say. "We can handle the law." But Joe wasn't sure anymore. One night in 1959, while meeting with another soldier in a quiet diner, Joe heard the first rumor that would one day change everything: Genovese thinks someone's talking. The words were casual, but the implication wasn't. Joe froze, pretending not to react, but inside his chest, a cold fear settled. The boss's paranoia was well known. When he suspected betrayal, he didn't wait for proof, he acted. The following weeks were tense. Joe noticed cars he didn't recognize parked near his house. He saw unfamiliar faces at meetings, men who watched more than they spoke. Even conversations between old friends felt strained. The tension was like static electricity, ready to ignite with the smallest spark. Then came the arrests. The narcotics division of the federal government had started cracking down, raiding warehouses and tracing supply chains. Dozens of low-level operatives were picked up. Some disappeared after release, others simply never made it back. Joe's name appeared on a list of suspects. He was questioned once, briefly, but he said nothing. He remembered the code: silence is survival. The problem was, silence no longer guaranteed safety. The Mafia's old rules were breaking down under the pressure of modern law enforcement. The same organization that once seemed untouchable was now being mapped, name, by men in suits with wiretaps and subpoenas. For the first time in his life, Joe saw fear in the eyes of bosses. It wasn't fear of rivals, it was fear of exposure. He started to notice small shifts in behavior. Conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Instructions delivered through third parties instead of directly. He was still useful, still trusted, or so he told himself, but deep down, he could feel the distance growing. Genovese's circle was tightening, and Joe wasn't inside it anymore. At night, he would lie awake beside Mildred, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word he had said in recent months, every glance exchanged at meetings. Had he offended someone? Had he been careless? Paranoia is a poison, and in the Mafia, it spread faster than loyalty. Then one afternoon, while walking out of a small restaurant, Joe saw two men he knew approaching from across the street, men who shouldn't have been there. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They just watched him. Joe's stomach turned to ice. Nothing happened that day, but the message was clear. He was being watched, maybe even tested. He didn't know it yet, but the path he was on would soon end in disaster. The narcotics empire he had helped build was collapsing under federal pressure. Genovese would be arrested in 1959 for heroin trafficking, accused by his own men. And Joe, caught in the same storm, would follow him into prison. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, Joe kept his head down, his gun close, and his faith in the code that had guided him his whole life. Yet deep down, something had shifted forever. He could feel the walls closing in, the law on one side, his own family on the other. The old Mafia had lived by silence, but silence was now becoming a death sentence. And though Joe didn't yet realize it, he was standing at the edge of a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, the line between soldier and survivor, between loyalty and betrayal. By 1959, Joe Valachi's quiet world of loyalty and order had collapsed into fear. The narcotics empire that once made fortunes was now bringing indictments, arrests, and death. The FBI was closing in, and even behind bars, the Mafia's reach never ended. Joe found himself imprisoned in Atlanta Penitentiary, alongside his own boss, Vito Genovese. At first, Joe believed prison would be routine. He had served time before, knowing silence was survival. But this was different. Genovese ruled the cell blocks like a paranoid king. He saw betrayal everywhere, convinced that someone inside the family had talked. Soon, whispers began to spread that Joe Valachi was the traitor. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Old friends stopped meeting his eyes, guards watched him with pity. Messages from outside ceased. In the dining hall, he noticed two men whispering, one giving him a faint smile, the kind of smile that never meant kindness. The air grew colder with each passing day. Then came the whisper that sealed his fate, the boss gave the kiss. The Mafia's silent verdict, death. That night, Joe lay awake listening to footsteps in the corridor, knowing one of them would come for him. All the years of loyalty, all the rules he had lived by, now meant nothing. The same code that had protected him had turned into his execution order. In that silence, Joe Valachi understood something he had never dared admit: the Mafia didn't love its soldiers, it used them. And as the lights flickered and the prison settled into uneasy quiet, Joe realized that survival, once bound to loyalty, would now demand the unthinkable. The order had been given, Vito Genovese had marked Joe Valachi for death. Inside Atlanta Penitentiary, that knowledge was a death sentence all on its own. Every face in the mess hall looked like a threat, every whisper felt like the last sound he might hear. Joe barely slept. He ate quickly, avoided crowds, and stayed close to guards, knowing that even one wrong step could end everything. One morning in 1962, the paranoia finally broke him. While walking through the prison yard, Joe saw another inmate approaching, quiet, expressionless, moving with purpose. The man's hand slipped into his pocket, and in a flash of terror, Joe was sure it was the hitman sent to kill him. Acting on pure instinct, he pulled out a piece of pipe and struck first, again and again, until the man fell lifeless on the ground. Only later did Joe learn the truth: the man wasn't a killer at all. He was a harmless prisoner, unarmed, walking by chance. But in Joe's mind, the Mafia had already murdered him 100 times before that day. His body had only caught up to his fear. After the killing, the prison erupted. Joe was restrained, trembling, his heart hammering with the realization of what he had done. The weight of decades of loyalty, fear, and blood crashed down at once. He hadn't killed an enemy, he had killed a reflection of his own madness. That night, alone in his cell, Joe Valachi faced the truth. The Mafia he had served his whole life no longer existed, only paranoia and ghosts remained. In the stillness of the prison, he understood what no oath could protect him from anymore: the family he had lived for had already buried him long before he ever struck that fatal blow. In 1963, the silence finally broke. After years of fear, prison, and betrayal, Joe Valachi did the unthinkable: he spoke. Sitting before a room full of senators, cameras, and journalists, he became the first made man in American history to publicly expose the Mafia's inner workings. The same man who had once lived by omerta, the sacred vow of silence, now shattered it with every word he uttered. His voice was calm, almost weary. He didn't sound proud or vengeful, he sounded tired, like a man confessing not for fame, but for relief. He described La Cosa Nostra as an invisible government, ruled by hierarchy and blood. He named names, revealed rituals, and explained the code that had ruled his life. America sat in stunned silence as the myth of the Mafia dissolved into fact. For Joe, the testimony was both liberation and death sentence. He knew what his confession meant: he could never walk free again, never trust another face. The Mafia didn't forgive betrayal, it erased it. But in that Senate chamber, Joe found a strange kind of peace. The world finally knew the truth he had carried for decades. Reporters called him the rat who revealed the Mafia. To the underworld, he was a traitor. To law enforcement, he was a hero. But to Joe himself, he was neither. He was a survivor, a man too broken to stay silent, too haunted to keep lying. When the hearings ended, the Mafia's veil was torn forever. The code that once kept the world blind now lay exposed under bright television lights. And though Joe Valachi's confession cost him everything, his freedom, his safety, his identity, it gave him one final victory: he was no longer afraid to speak. After Joe Valachi's testimony, the world wanted more. The Senate hearings had shocked America, but people craved details: the inner codes, the secrets, the faces behind the headlines. And so began the Valachi Papers, a collection of his memories, interviews, and written confessions that opened a door the Mafia had spent half a century keeping shut. Inside those pages, Joe explained what no one outside the organization had ever understood: how a man was made, how orders were given, how loyalty was enforced. He described the initiation ceremony, the prick of the finger, the burning of the saint's image, the oath sworn in silence. It was sacred and terrifying, a ritual that bound a man for life. For the first time, the American public could see the Mafia not as a myth, but as a system, a shadow government ruled by money, fear, and blood. The papers read like scripture and confession at once. Joe named bosses, capos, soldiers, and entire families. He described the wars, the betrayals, the invisible council known as the Commission. He spoke of men who killed their friends, of money laundered through legitimate fronts, of the endless paranoia that came with power. Every page was another nail in the coffin of the code he once lived by. Law enforcement hailed him as a hero. The Mafia branded him a traitor. But to Joe, the truth was simpler: he was just a man who had finally run out of silence. Behind the facts and figures, his words carried exhaustion, regret, and an aching desire to make sense of it all. When the Valachi papers were published, they didn't just reveal a secret, they changed history. The Mafia could never hide again, not after one of its own had spoken with such weary honesty. Prison became Joe Valachi's world once more, a world stripped of noise and purpose, where time itself seemed to dissolve into a dull gray fog. The Senate hearings had ended, the headlines had faded, and the man who once shook the underworld with his testimony now sat alone in a cell, haunted by what he had done. His words had made him infamous, but infamy was no comfort. The Mafia's silence had been broken, but the price of breaking it was total isolation. There were no friends left to trust, no family that could protect him, no safe corner of the world where his name wasn't cursed. He was transferred frequently between federal institutions, each one more secure than the last. The government moved him like a fragile secret, fearing both his assassination and his own despair. One warden described him as a man alive only out of habit. He ate mechanically, slept fitfully, and rarely spoke. His fellow inmates either avoided him entirely or looked at him with quiet hatred. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a warning. Either way, he was untouchable. His protective custody meant he lived apart from the general population. Days passed in silence, no conversation, no routine beyond the rhythm of meals and lights out. The guards, though respectful, kept their distance. Even they knew who he was. When they looked at him, they saw not a man, but a symbol, a living ghost of the Mafia's darkest secrets. Joe felt it, too. He was no longer part of that world, but it still followed him, whispering through the cracks in the concrete. At night, the past came back in fragments. He would dream of faces long gone, men laughing over wine, deals made in smoky backrooms, the sharp smell of gunpowder in cold air. Sometimes he woke up sweating, convinced that someone was standing over his bed. There were nights when he whispered to himself, as though talking to ghosts, Reina, Luciano, Genovese, and all the others who had shaped his life. He couldn't escape them, they were carved into his mind. He had exposed their empire, but in doing so, he had trapped himself within its memory. The loneliness was unbearable. Even the agents who had once guarded him began to treat him as a burden rather than a source of value. The investigations sparked by his testimony were long over, the public had moved on. America had found new villains, new stories to occupy its imagination. But Joe remained frozen in time, a relic of an era the country preferred to forget. He wrote letters sometimes, but few were answered. Mildred, his wife, stayed loyal for a while, sending brief notes filled with cautious affection. "I hope you are well, Joe," she wrote once. "They say people forget, but I never will." But the years took their toll. The danger surrounding his name made even love impossible. He couldn't see her, couldn't call her, couldn't risk contact. Eventually, the letters stopped coming. Joe never blamed her. In a way, it was a mercy. She deserved a life untouched by the shadow that followed him. In the solitude of his cell, Joe began to turn inward. He started keeping a journal, simple, unpolished notes about the past. Some pages were confessions, others reflections. He wrote about the Mafia structure, about the meaning of loyalty, about the quiet destruction of the men who lived by it. "We thought we were strong," he scrawled once, "but we were only slaves to our own fear." His words were not for the world, they were for himself, a way to make sense of the life he had lived and the emptiness it had left behind. Occasionally, government officials or journalists requested interviews, hoping to extract more details for books or films. Joe always refused. He had already said what needed to be said. "There's nothing left," he told one guard. "They wanted the truth, and I gave it to them. Now all that's left is waiting." The guard didn't ask what he was waiting for. He didn't have to. Everyone who looked at Joe knew the answer: death, when it finally decided to come. The years blurred together. He moved from one facility to another, always under assumed names, always under guard. Sometimes the guards changed and didn't recognize him right away. To them, he was just an old inmate with tired eyes. They didn't realize they were speaking to the man who had once exposed the inner workings of the Mafia to the entire world. In those rare moments of anonymity, Joe almost felt human again. But the quiet never lasted. Rumors of threats still surfaced from time to time, plans by old Mafia soldiers to finish the job. Some were real, others imagined. The government took no chances. They tightened his security, restricted visitors, and kept his location classified. Joe appreciated the protection, but it only deepened his isolation. He was a man the world wanted alive only so long as he remained invisible. His health began to fail in the 1970s. Years of stress, poor diet, and constant fear had eroded his body. His hair thinned, his eyesight dimmed, and his hands trembled when he tried to write. Doctors treated him with indifference, as though tending to a ghost. He spent long hours staring at the small window of his cell, watching the light shift across the floor. That was his calendar now, the slow dance of sunlight on concrete. The guard said he talked to himself more often toward the end. Sometimes they heard him speaking Italian, other times English, sometimes names. Tommy. Vito. Lucky, like a priest reciting a litany of lost souls. On quiet nights, he hummed old songs from the neighborhood, soft melodies from the cafes of Mulberry Street, echoes of a world long gone. When word of the Valachi Papers movie reached him in 1972, he barely reacted. The story of his life, once feared, now commodified, was being retold by actors on the silver screen. He didn't resent it. In fact, he found it strange, almost comforting, that his name would outlive him in some form, even if distorted. "Maybe people will understand," he muttered once to a guard. "Not forgive, but understand." He never saw the film. By then, his world had shrunk to a few square feet, a metal cot, and a memory that never stopped replaying itself. He knew the Mafia still existed, changed, evolved, but alive. And he knew they would never forgive him, even in death. Still, there were moments of unexpected calm. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, he would sit quietly and close his eyes, imagining he was back in the Bronx in his youth, the smell of bread, the sound of laughter, the sun warm on his face. In those brief moments, the walls around him disappeared, and he could almost believe that the life he lived had been just a long, strange dream. But the peace never lasted long. The ghosts always returned. He saw them in his mind, the faces of men he'd killed, men he'd betrayed, men who once trusted him. They never spoke, they only looked at him, their silence a mirror of his own. In those moments, he understood what true punishment meant. Not pain, not fear, but memory. When death finally came for Joe Valachi in 1971, it came quietly, as if even death had been waiting for him to be ready. He was found alone in his cell, slumped peacefully on his cot, a faint trace of a smile on his face. The cause was listed as a heart attack. Some said it was suicide. Others believed he simply stopped fighting. There was no funeral, no mourners, no family present. The man who once revealed the Mafia's darkest secrets was buried in an unmarked grave under a false name. The government feared that marking his resting place would invite violence or desecration. So they gave him anonymity in death, the one thing he had never been allowed in life. In the stillness that followed, the world barely noticed his passing. Newspapers printed brief obituaries, recalling his testimony and the legend of the Mafia whistleblower. But for those who remembered the hearings of 1963, for those who had heard his weary voice exposing the truth, the news carried a quiet irony. Joe Valachi had spent a lifetime surrounded by men who swore silence, only to become the one voice that broke it, and in the end, that voice faded back into silence. History would never quite agree on how to remember Joseph Valachi. To some, he was the first man brave enough to pierce the Mafia's veil of secrecy, a man who risked his life to tell the world how power, loyalty, and murder intertwined behind the curtain of American respectability. To others, he was nothing but a coward, a rat who betrayed his brothers for a lighter sentence and a chance to save his own skin. In the years after his death, his name became a kind of myth, half truth, half curse. But one thing no one could deny was that his testimony had changed the course of American law enforcement forever. Before Valachi spoke, the Mafia was a rumor. Police departments called it the so-called syndicate, and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover refused to acknowledge its existence publicly. There were whispers, of course, headlines about gangland murders, mysterious disappearances, union corruption, but no one had ever laid out its structure in plain words. Valachi had done that. He had taken a world built on silence and mapped it, showing the lines of power, the code of loyalty, and the machinery of violence that kept it running. His confession had been both an act of defiance and destruction. In the years following his Senate testimony, the U.S. government began to rebuild its understanding of organized crime from the ground up. The FBI formed specialized divisions to investigate Mafia families, creating detailed charts and surveillance programs based on Valachi's framework. Agents who once chased bootleggers and bookies now tracked soldiers and capos. For the first time, law enforcement began to see the Mafia not as scattered gangs but as a national network, a shadow government that taxed and controlled industries, neighborhoods, and lives. His revelations paved the way for future investigations that would eventually lead to the downfall of legendary bosses, Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, and even Vito Genovese's successors. The famous RICO Act, the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations law of 1970, owed part of its conceptual roots to Valachi's disclosures. Without his testimony, the government might never have had the vocabulary or understanding to craft laws that treated organized crime as a system rather than a collection of isolated crimes. And yet, even as the institutions of power praised his cooperation, the world Joe came from, his world, spat on his name. Within the Mafia, pulling a Valachi became synonymous with betrayal. It was said with disgust, whispered as a warning to younger soldiers, die before you talk. To them, Joe was the ultimate example of what happened when fear triumphed over honor. His image became a kind of morality tale, twisted and retold in dark backrooms, an example of how even the most loyal soldier could lose his soul when the shadows grew too long. Among ordinary Americans, the reaction was more complicated. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man destroyed by the very system he had helped sustain. Journalists wrote about him as a symbol of conscience, a broken man seeking redemption through truth. Others dismissed him as self-serving, arguing that he only talked when he realized the Mafia had turned on him. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Joe was neither hero nor coward. He was simply human, a man who had followed orders all his life until the day obedience led him to madness. The legacy of his betrayal rippled through the decades. After the hearings, mobsters became more cautious, more insulated. The era of open gatherings and public displays of power began to fade. The Mafia learned from Valachi's mistake, tightening its inner circle and adapting to a world where the government finally understood how it worked. Ironically, the man they condemned had forced them to evolve, to become smarter and more secretive. Even Hollywood took inspiration from his story. The gangster films of the 1970s, the gritty, introspective ones that explored loyalty, guilt, and moral decay, owed much to the myth of Joe Valachi. He had revealed the human side of organized crime, not the glamorous world of silk suits and smoky bars, but the paranoia, the isolation, the slow corrosion of the soul. When movies like The Godfather and Serpico hit theaters, audiences were already primed by Valachi's testimony to see the Mafia not as fantasy, but as something real and terrible beneath the surface of the American dream. Academics and sociologists studied him, too. They debated whether he had exaggerated parts of his story or whether his testimony had been manipulated by the government for dramatic effect. Some believed he had embellished events, merging fact and rumor to stay alive. Others insisted his recollections were remarkably consistent with later FBI evidence. Whatever the case, one truth remained: his words had opened a door that could never again be closed. For the men who had lived by Omerta, Joe Valachi's name was a curse whispered like a prayer of warning. For law enforcement, it was a key, one that unlocked decades of investigation. And for history, it became a symbol of contradiction, a criminal who brought justice, a traitor who told the truth. In the quiet years after his death, his story was revisited again and again. Books were written, documentaries filmed, professors lectured about him in criminology classes. Yet the image that lingered most wasn't of the Senate hearings or the newspaper headlines, it was of an old man in a gray cell, sitting alone with his memories. A man who had once belonged to something vast and terrible, now reduced to silence once again. And perhaps that was fitting. For all the noise his revelations made, Joe Valachi's life had always been defined by silence, its power, its comfort, and finally, its collapse. His entire world had been built on an oath never to speak. Breaking that oath had freed him and doomed him in equal measure. Some called him a Judas of the underworld, others, a saint of confession. But in truth, he was neither. He was simply the inevitable result of a world built on secrecy and fear. In that world, silence was supposed to protect men, but for Joe Valachi, it had only ever destroyed them. Decades later, when historians looked back at his life, they saw not just a man, but a mirror, a reflection of the American Mafia's rise, its golden age, and its slow unraveling. His story marked the turning point, the moment when the shadows began to shrink under the weight of their own exposure. He had once said during his testimony, "We thought we had a family, but it was only business." In the end, that sentence might have been his truest confession. The Mafia called itself La Cosa Nostra, our thing, but to Joe Valachi, it had never really belonged to anyone. It was a beast that devoured all who fed it. And though he died alone and forgotten, his voice still echoed quietly through history, the voice of a man who dared to break the silence of the underworld and, in doing so, changed it forever. In the final chapter of Joe Valachi's life, time itself seemed to slow down, as if the world were quietly waiting for him to fade from its memory. He had become, by then, more legend than man, a name that evoked whispers in backrooms, footnotes in FBI reports, and cautionary tales told to new generations of mob soldiers. But for Joe, there was no glory in legend, no pride in what he had revealed. What he wanted most in those last years was something far simpler than redemption or recognition. He wanted peace, something he had never known in all his decades of loyalty, violence, and fear. The man who had once stood before the U.S. Senate, confessing the secrets of La Cosa Nostra, now spent his days in quiet confinement, his world reduced to a few square feet of concrete and the slow, methodical ticking of time. Outside his prison cell, the Mafia had evolved without him. The faces were new, the money cleaner, the operations more discreet. The world of the old bosses, Luciano, Genovese, Gagliano, was gone, buried beneath years of arrests and adaptation. But their shadow still lingered, and Joe, sitting alone on his cot, could feel it pressing down like an unshakable weight. He was an old man now, frail and pale, with thinning hair and a face deeply lined by the years. The guards who watched him came and went, often unaware of who he truly was. To them, he was just another aging inmate, a quiet one, polite and strangely dignified. They couldn't imagine that this tired old figure had once stood at the center of a storm that changed American history. Joe rarely spoke. When he did, his words were soft, measured, and often tinged with regret. "I broke the silence," he told a prison chaplain once, "but I didn't find freedom in it. I only found more silence." The priest nodded, unsure how to respond. For all his sins, Joe wasn't looking for forgiveness anymore. He had long since accepted that some debts couldn't be repaid. His confessions before the Senate had freed the world of its ignorance, but they had not freed him from his past. Each day, he followed the same small rituals that gave structure to the endless hours. He woke early, made his bed neatly, ate whatever was placed before him, and spent long periods sitting by the small barred window in his cell. Through it, he could see only a sliver of sky, sometimes gray, sometimes streaked with sunlight. That patch of sky became his measure of the world's rhythm, day into night, night into day. Seasons changed, and he remained the same. Sometimes, he would speak softly to himself, revisiting moments from his past as though reciting a litany of ghosts. Reina. Lucky. Vito, he would whisper, each name carrying a different weight, admiration, fear, sorrow. They were all gone now, swallowed by time and consequence, but in Joe's memory they were still vivid, faces illuminated by cigarette smoke, voices echoing across dark taverns, laughter masking betrayal. He would close his eyes and almost hear the street sounds of his youth, the rumble of trains, the cry of fruit vendors in Little Italy, the laughter of young men who thought they were invincible. At night, sleep often eluded him. In those long, restless hours, he would replay the events of his life like scenes in an old film, his initiation into the Mafia, his first job, the years of discipline, the betrayal that led to his paranoia, and the moment he chose to speak. The memories came and went, blurring together until they felt more like someone else's story than his own. Sometimes he laughed quietly at the irony of it all, a man who once lived by omerta remembered now for breaking it. He never expressed anger toward those who condemned him. In his heart, he understood them. The code he broke was sacred, and in that world, betrayal was the ultimate sin. But he also knew that the Mafia he had joined, the one that promised loyalty, family, and honor, had died long before he ever spoke a word to the government. "They broke the code first," he would murmur. "They forgot what it meant." Those words, repeated like a prayer, were the only justification he ever offered for his choices. In rare moments of reflection, Joe wondered what his life might have been if he had walked a different path, if he had ignored the allure of the men in suits who ruled the neighborhood when he was a boy. Perhaps he would have become a mechanic, or a shopkeeper, or just another face in the crowd. But then he would shake his head and smile faintly. "I was born into it," he'd say. "Some of us never had a choice." In his later years, the FBI declassified portions of his testimony, and the Valachi papers was published for the public to read. Copies of the book even found their way into prison libraries, though Joe never asked for one. He had no interest in seeing his life turned into print. "They can have the story," he said once to a guard. "It's not mine anymore." As the years wore on, his health declined. The constant tension, the loneliness, and the weight of memory had worn down his body. He suffered from ulcers, heart trouble, and insomnia. Yet he never complained. When doctors came to check on him, he nodded politely and thanked them, but he refused special treatment. He said he had lived long enough, and whatever time remained was just borrowed hours. In those last quiet months, something in him softened. The anger, the fear, the bitterness, they faded into a kind of melancholy peace. He spent his evenings sitting near the window, watching the light fade into dusk, humming old Italian songs under his breath. To those who saw him then, he seemed less like a criminal and more like a man who had already made peace with his ghosts. On the night before his death in April 1971, Joe was seen reading his worn Bible, its pages creased and marked. When the guard asked him if he wanted the light left on, Joe smiled faintly and said, "No need. I've seen enough light for one life." The next morning, they found him slumped peacefully on his cot, his hands folded neatly over his chest. He was 70 years old. The world barely noticed. A few short obituaries appeared in the papers, summarizing his life in cold, efficient sentences: Joseph Valachi, former Mafia member turned informant, dead at 70. There were no flowers, no mourners, no eulogies. His body was buried quietly in an unmarked grave under a false name. The government feared retaliation, even decades after his betrayal. His grave became as anonymous as the man he once was before the Mafia claimed him. And yet, the silence that followed his death carried its own strange dignity. For all his sins, Joe Valachi had done something no one before him had dared to do: he spoke truth into a world built entirely on lies. He had exposed a machine of blood and greed that thrived on secrecy. His words had given the law a weapon and had stripped the Mafia of its greatest power, its invisibility. In the end, that was his legacy: not glory, not forgiveness, but revelation. He had shown the world that behind every oath of honor was fear, behind every code of silence was suffering, and behind every empire of crime were men, broken, frightened, and trapped by their own creation. And so, Joe Valachi's story ended where it began, in silence. But this time, it was not the silence of fear or obedience. It was the silence of final rest, the hush that comes when a man's long struggle with his own soul is finally over. The walls that had once imprisoned him no longer mattered. The code he had broken no longer held meaning. Only the quiet remained. Outside, the world moved on, new wars, new presidents, new crimes. But somewhere in the quiet corners of history, his name still lingered, a faint echo reminding the world that even in the darkest systems of loyalty and power, one whisper of truth could shake the foundations of silence itself.